Hello everyone, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 2, Activity-Based Costing. So Chapter 1 we did job costing and we learned about the idea of a predetermined overhead rate where we take our overhead that we estimate for the upcoming year and we look at determining a cost driver and we divide that overhead by the cost driver to get a predetermined overhead rate, and then we allocate that, use that predetermined overhead rate to allocate the overhead to the jobs. Okay, so we're going to be very closely related to this, and the concept is, do we have one predetermined overhead rate, or does it justify many predetermined overhead rates? So we're going to need to break it into smaller pieces so we can get a better view of our costs. And so while this is maybe easiest to see using job costing or related to job costing from Chapter 1, it is also available and can be used with process costing, which will be what we learn in Chapter 3. Okay, so we can apply this activity-based costing concept to either job costing or process costing. So let's jump in with a little review of what we've already learned, okay, in previous classes. Okay, first of all, direct labor and direct materials, and assigning that to inventory and tracking it, the increase through work in process. That has not changed, and it should remain fairly straightforward. So the example of the bicycle requires 2 wheels for assembly. Those are direct materials. All right, and so all we need to do to know that is we simply look up the cost of those 2 wheels and include them in the cost of the bicycle. So if we use 2 wheels, then the cost of 2 wheels moves from direct raw materials into work in process, and then ultimately when we're finished with the bicycle it moves into finished goods, and then when we sell the bicycle on to cost of goods sold. So that process of using direct costs or direct materials in this example is not going to change regardless of how we utilize activity-based costing in this chapter. Okay, so this is only about overhead. Direct costs continue to be tracked the same way as we've already learned. Same thing with direct labor. As an example here again with the bicycle, how many hours does it take to assemble? We can see that, measure that. Okay, straightforward to know the cost of that hour is. Maybe there's some benefit costs and taxes and things that we need to that we didn't really talk about when we talked about direct labor, but it should be probably involved. And that makes it a little more complicated. All right, and like we said, some people work faster than others. But on average, we can come up with an idea of how many hours it takes to make the bicycle. So we can directly associate that labor with making the bicycle. That cost moves to work in process, then to finished goods, and then to cost of goods sold, just like we talked about with direct materials. So that's the direct cost, and in that way, that process hasn't changed, okay, with what we're learning here in activity-based costing. So it's when we get to the third component, overhead, manufacturing overhead, factory overhead, whatever you want to call it, okay? These indirect costs cannot be directly traced to the bicycle. So we're going to have to do some kind of estimate, some kind of allocation, okay? Similar to that predetermined overhead rate we learned about in Chapter 1, okay? So some examples just as a review. If we stick with our bicycle example, utilities for the factory, supervision, tools, lots of things go into making the bicycle other than wheels, other than the direct labor. Okay, so when we ask ourselves how much of the utilities does making one bicycle use up? All right, how much supervision does one bicycle use up? What tools, okay, how much of the tools is used up to make one bicycle? These are difficult questions, okay, and questions that there are not direct answers for. Hence the reason why these are indirect costs. There is no direct tie from the utilities to the bicycles, okay? So it may even seem impossible, but we cannot just throw our hands in the air and say, oh, it doesn't matter, okay, because it's too hard to figure out, all right? We can't ignore these costs. Otherwise, if we say all we got to do is cover the cost of direct materials and direct labor, we're going to lose money on our bicycles. We have to cover, when we sell it, we have to get enough to cover our direct costs and our indirect costs, no matter how difficult they are to work with or allocate. Okay, and if we don't ever track or do any accounting with the overhead, then the tendency is they get ignored. And what happens to costs that get ignored? They tend to go up. They tend to become inefficient. We don't find better ways to use it. We don't find better ways to use the utilities because we haven't bothered to measure how much utilities. We said, oh, it's too hard to figure out, and therefore there's no way to know. But we can use some estimates and then identify the results of trying to improve and become more efficient with the use of these overhead costs. And that's really our goal. And the reality in life is that if it's not measured, nobody cares about it. Okay, if you don't measure the cost, if you don't try to, then it doesn't get the attention it deserves, and you're not going to see improvement. So, how many predetermined overhead rates are you going to end up with? So, last chapter we estimated overhead in total. We looked at all the overhead in one big pile, if you will, and divided it by a single activity rate and got one predetermined overhead rate. In your textbook, okay, this is referred to as the one plant-wide rate. So it's pretty simple. You put everything in one pile, okay? You only have one cost driver that you need to come up with, or activity that you need to come up with. And the math is relatively easy. You don't have any real classification. You don't have to go through all your overhead and try to break it into smaller pieces. And this will be fine as long as your products are similar. Okay, that if you make bicycles or different types of bicycles, maybe there's no need to have more than one predetermined overhead rate. Okay, the production process is relatively simple. It's not complex. The products are similar, which means they don't use different levels of resources. But when a process is more complex, when it goes through things for a longer period of time, or that it has specialized things and your products are different, okay, meaning one product uses a lot more machines, another product uses a lot more direct labor, another uses more setup time, okay, one rate may not be very accurate, and then you're not going to get a sense of what products are using, what the resources they're using, and what you should come up with for the cost of those to your customers. You may need more than one rate so you can understand where your overhead costs are coming from. By putting them in one big pile, it tends to make it so that they can hide, meaning some overhead costs are not going to get any attention because they're lumped in with all the others, and therefore we don't have a good basis to analyze them and find better ways or cheaper ways or more efficient ways, I should say, to accomplish what we're trying to do. So, how do we apply activity-based costing? All right. So, first step is to take the total overhead and divide it up into 2 to 8 cost pools. Now, when I say 2 to 8, some research has indicated once you get more than 8, you make your life more complicated. Okay, and the more cost pools you have, the more complicated your process and everything is. But you don't really get better information because the cost pools are, when you get more than 8 or 7 or 8, they are related to each other close enough that you're not really seeing differences. Okay, so but of course if you're just doing one, then it's just a plant-wide rate. So it doesn't make, it's not really activity-based costing. So now, a couple of things to remember. This is the same overhead as you would have done in Chapter 1, okay, when you estimate the overhead. So all we've done is taken the same pile overhead and we've broken it or separated it into smaller piles with the hope that by breaking into smaller piles, we can better understand what's happening. So rather than looking at overhead as one big thing, we're looking at separate overhead functions like maintenance, like shipping and receiving. All right. So rather than lumping those two together, we're now separating them into cost pools. So if you added up our cost pools, they would still be the same total as if we were using one plant-wide rate. It's not like we're adding we're not finding new overhead. We're taking the same dollars and just dividing it in smaller pieces to better understand it. So once we have our cost pools, let's say we have 3 of them, okay, then each cost pool needs its own activity or cost rate or cost driver. What is the activity that this company does that makes that particular part of the overhead go up or down? Okay? So we need something that's going to be easily measured. We need something that's not, somebody doesn't have to stand there and count. All right, we're talking about something that we're already keeping track of, most likely. All right, that determines how much of that cost pool. So if our cost pool is maintenance, okay, and so we have costs that go into that maintenance cost pool. There are people that work in in maintenance. There are supplies that are used in maintenance. All right, there may be tools that are used in maintenance. That makes up our cost pool. Now the question is, what activity determines how much maintenance we do? Is it the number of machines we have in our part of the factory? Is it the number of machine hours we use? Is it the square footage of the factory? Because everything's kind of laid out basically even. So if you use more of the factory, you're going to use more maintenance. Okay? So that's the question. If we use more of our, whatever the activity is, would we also use more of the costs? That's why it's called a cost driver. It drives the costs. It's the reason why we have more of them, that sort of thing. So each cost pool has to have a cost driver. Now, fortunately for you, for the homework, for our purposes, we're going to usually make it fairly clear what the cost driver is, what the cost pools are. In real life, that's one of the most difficult parts of this whole process, is determining what should be in each cost pool. And some costs are going to have to be even allocated between cost pools. So, for instance, there may be utilities that go in the maintenance cost pool, and there may be utilities that go into another cost pool, like the shipping and receiving cost pool. All right, so that's a difficult thing, but in our examples, we're going to have most of that heavy lifting already done and determined. So what we're going to focus on is how to allocate those costs. So you take that cost pool, each cost pool, okay, and what the costs are for that cost pool estimated, and divide it by the activity rate for that cost driver. So we've come up with a cost driver for each cost pool, match it up, and that gives us a predetermined overhead rate for each cost pool. So if you have 3 cost pools, you need 3 cost drivers, and you're going to have 3 predetermined overhead rates. Okay? And so instead of 1, like we learned about last chapter, we're going to have 3. So if one of our cost pools is maintenance, and we include in that labor, people working at supplies, tools, and is estimated $800,000. So we have put some dollar amounts here to show how this was going to work. We identify the activity or measure, okay, the cost driver. Then say we think that number of machines in the particular department or on a particular job or for a particular product, that seems to be a good cost driver, because the more machines we have, the more maintenance is needed. The more we have to call maintenance, the more maintenance people we would use, more maintenance supplies that would be used to maintain our machines. So if our department has 400 machines and another department has 200 machines, we would expect to use about twice as much maintenance as the other department. Or if our job requires 400 machines and the other job requires 200 machines, we would expect to use about twice as much maintenance. Okay, again, nothing perfect here. These are estimates. All right, we're just trying to get an idea of what it is that makes the cost go up. So the predetermined overhead rate, the math, if you will, which should be relatively straightforward, is the cost pool amount, $800,000, divided by, in this case, what we determined was the cost driver, number of machines, 400, okay, total machines equals $2,000 machine, okay? We could have used another one. You can even change from year to year, okay? What you can't do, okay, is allocate the same cost 2 different ways, right? That doesn't make sense, okay? So you can't allocate this $800,000 using machines and then allocate it again using, machine hours. Otherwise, you're going to be double counting. Okay? There's no absolute right answer. You can use different ones. Different companies will use different ones. There is nothing. What you want to do is work with one, see what you think is what's happening with the costs, see if it makes sense. You can always change it going forward for next year. Okay? That sort of thing. So if job B, if we were doing job costing, or department M, which is the terminology we're going to use in process costing next week, or product XL, okay, uses 40 machines, then we would allocate maintenance overhead costs like this. We would take 40 machines times $2,000 per machine, or $80,000 of overhead would go to job B or department N or product XL, whichever we were using. Okay, that would be a debit or an increase to the work in process for that job, all right, and a credit or a decrease to the overhead cost pool account. So we've taken money out of that overhead account, which is what we learned about last time as well, overhead account, and applied it to a job or a product or a department. Okay, this can be done as an estimate before we've done the job, before we've done the product. If someone calls up and wants to know how much it's going to cost, we can also do it after the fact as a way of actually tracking the costs that should be for that particular job and calculate cost of goods sold like we've talked about earlier. Each cost pool will go through the same process and be allocated to each department or job or product. All right, so when we are done, if there are 3 overhead cost pools, and we can do these allocations monthly, we can do them weekly, we can do them only when the job is or the project is finished, we can do it only at the end of the year. That would seem to be extreme. Typically, you're going to do it periodically. And then remember, you have your predetermined, your under or over applied overhead at the end of the year that has to be corrected. And you would do that for each overhead cost pool separately rather than just one overhead cost like we did in Chapter 1. So when we are done, or as we're looking at the cost of our particular either product or department or job, we would have the direct materials and direct labor as we have already learned. Okay? Nothing changed with that in regard to those. And then we have allocated overhead from cost pool 1. Remember, we have 3 cost pools to that department or product or job. We'd allocate from cost pool 2 to that department, product, or job, and from cost pool 3 to that department, product, or job. So instead of having direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, we have direct materials, direct labor, overhead from each cost pool separately. And I would generally encourage you to do those separately so you can make sure that you've got them all rather than kind of adding them together to try to save time. That's what's equal total cost. So if you're doing a job, to know how much the cost of the job is and how much of the cost of the job needs to be moved to finished goods, you'd need to know the direct materials, direct labor, and the allocation from each cost pool. And if that total cost is not what you're after, maybe you don't want the total cost, maybe you want a cost per unit, just divide that total cost by the number of units produced. So if you make 3,000 units, you take your total cost, you divide by 3,000, that's your cost per unit. That will help you determine what you should charge your customers, right? Because you want to cover the cost of making the product when you have set a price for your customers. So, reviewing the formula again, okay, just to make sure it's cemented in our brain. Okay, we start with dividing the estimated overhead into cost pools that are related. Again, no magic as to exactly how many, but it will depend on the company and what the types of overhead they have. But we try to get them into cost pools that are related. Identify a cost driver from each cost pool. All right. Then estimate the cost driver activity rate. Okay, so how much of the cost driver is going to be used in the future period. So we have the estimated overhead. Remember, this is all being done typically before anything has been actually started for the year. Divide the total cost pool, just that one, the individual cost pools, by the activity rate of the cost driver for that pool. So we do it, if we had 3 cost pools, we do it 3 times. We had 4 cost pools, we do it 4 times. Okay. Then we allocate the cost pool to departments, jobs, or products by multiplying the predetermined overhead rate by how much of the cost driver activities that department or job or product uses. So if they use that part of the cost. Okay. Then if we're actually making the journal entries or the actual keeping track of it, and we're not just doing this as an estimate, we credit or reduce the overhead account and debit or increase the work in process account. All right, for that overhead. That's called allocating, applying the overhead. You'll hear that term, see that term, applying overhead. I probably more likely to say allocating overhead, but it means the same thing. So the question is, that sounds like some extra work. Okay? is it a good idea each time? Is it going to give us better information? Is this a better estimate than just doing it all in one big pile and one cost driver and be done with it? Okay? So that depends. Is this going to be better? Well, the more we think, or the better our thinking about the cost driver, meaning if we did a good job of choosing the cost drivers, of identifying cost drivers that are truly about using resources, then our estimates are going to be better. If we don't, if we're sloppy with that, okay, we're not going to get better information. Okay? When products or jobs or departments are significantly different in terms of the resources that they use, then activity-based costing, ABC, can give us better information. Example. Okay, product A requires a very complex setup process and then 5 hours of direct labor to make the product. While product B, and this could be job A and job B, okay, doesn't matter, takes a quick setup, meaning it doesn't take very long, it's not very complicated, but it still takes 5 hours of direct labor to make. So if you were to put all of your overhead in one big pile and allocate using direct labor only, product A and product B would get the same amount of overhead because they both use 5 hours. If that's our allocation, that's our activity rate, then we're going to give them the same product cost and then probably charge our customers the same price. If we use two cost pools, let's just say setups we separate out and then all the rest, then we're actually measuring the extra work of setup for product A. We would allocate more of the setup cost to product A than we would to product B. Now, product B doesn't have no setup. It just has a quicker setup, and so it uses less setup cost. All right, and therefore, we would want to allocate, all right, product A more costs for setup, all the other costs, and less setup cost to product B. All the rest of the costs could be divided evenly. And that might be fair, if you will. Okay, so that's kind of sometimes you want to think about. Is it fair that product A and B, in this example, get the same overhead cost? Or is it more fair to say that product A should get more setup costs and the same amount of regular costs, and product B should get less setup costs and more of the regular costs? That would probably be considered more fair, right? And better indicate the use of resources. All right, so then now because we're allocating those setups, we get a better feel for how to make setups more efficient. When the setups are just lumped in with all the rest of the overhead, they don't get much attention, and therefore we may go along thinking we're being as efficient as possible, and when we're not. Okay? So there are issues that would come if we don't track those setup costs separately in this situation where product A has a much higher setup cost than product B.